All right. So first, Jordi will speak. Yeah. Jordi is at the AI department of the Radboud University, and yeah, I will talk about the methods for non-invasive BCIs. Welcome.
Good. Let's start with this first session in the early morning then. I prepared also a short start warm-up for this session that I'm giving today. I extended the title as well, so it reads in the program simply towards high-speed non-invasive BCI for communication control. But then I added using efficient encoding, decoding, and small data sets. So big promises. Let's see where this leads. No, that doesn't work. How do I move to the next slide? Just like that then. Okay, good. So first things first, in my session, I will be only talking about non-invasive BCIs. Nick Ramsey, after my talk, will actually talk about invasive BCIs. And specifically, I mean, there's different methods. You might be familiar to them for both domains. So for non-invasive BCIs, you can choose a couple, for instance, EEG, MEG. But what I will focus on today is only EEG, which is typically more practical for BCI applications. And in the EEG realm, there's actually different flavors of signals that we can use, let's say control signals, right? So there's the oscillatory signals, for instance, imagining whether you're moving your left arm versus your right arm. You see nice potentials at the contralateral hemisphere that we can use for decoding, let's say a binary classifier. This, again, is not what I will talk about. What I will talk about is evoked responses. The responses to some external stimulus that is really time-locked to the onset of the stimulus, so really the latencies at a particular, the amplitude, let's say, at a particular latency of the response. This is what is the useful information for us right now. Okay, contrasted to with the oscillations, then actually the frequency, the power at a particular frequency would be interesting. Now, in these evoked responses, we can essentially make a distinction between three main flavors. One of these is transient responses, and I think most of you might be familiar to these. So the so-called event-related potentials. Think about P300, mismatch negativity, error-related negativity, these type of ERPs. They are typically the responses to single events, right? So you present one stimulus, one tone, or one flash, and you record the response after that one event, okay? Contrasted with that is also a well-known paradigm, which are steady-state responses. So for instance, steady-state visual evoked potentials. So essentially what we're doing is what is called frequency tagging. This was also mentioned yesterday for those that attended yesterday. The idea is that we present a periodic sequence of events. So not a single event, but actually a sequence of events. And let's say the stimulus onset asynchrony, the time in between the intervals of each of these stimuli, they're constant. Right? So we're presenting a type of frequency. This leads to maybe neural entrainment, but I'll show you later that there's actually another idea, linear superposition, but it leads to responses that are tuned to that frequency. So in the brain, for instance, with visual stimulation at 40 Hertz, in the brain, we see an oscillation of 40 Hertz back. Okay, so we can actually look into the brain, see which frequency is increasing in power, and then we can decode to maybe which of the several stimuli that you're attending to. But then there's a third class, which is typically a little bit ignored, which is broadband responses. And this is mostly contrasting to the steady state responses. So the steady state responses, they use one frequency, let's say, so they're very narrow band. Broadband responses, they actually use the entire frequency content throughout the frequency domain. The way that they do this by, again, presenting sequences of events, so multiple flashes, for instance, but they do it in a non-periodic way, right? Contrasted to the steady-state evoked potentials. That means they can use pseudo-random codes that might be optimized in certain ways, but the idea is that the interstimulus interval is essentially non-constant. Okay? A good example is the code-modulated visual evoked potential. It's essentially what I will talk about in this talk. To quickly give an overview of how this is related to something that we actually already knew years ago from telecommunication, that in telecommunication, they have time domain multiple access, frequency domain multiple access, code domain multiple access. So the names that I show here in the top corners. And these map directly actually on these three flavors that we have here. right? So either you give your users access to certain time bins. This is time domain multiple access, time domain multiple access, which is time modulated visual evoked potential, so mostly related to the transient responses. Or you give your users a narrowband frequency to communicate in, and now they can actually communicate in parallel, right, at the same time, but at different frequencies. So there's actually more information that we can now utilize, but really at narrowband frequencies. So this would be steady state responses. And finally, we can actually mix everything together. So both in time as well as in frequency, everything is sort of used in terms of information, but they're modulated by certain codes. What these codes mean, I'll get back later. Good. So just some quick examples. So in the transient responses domain, what you might be used to is the P300 speller. It's a very standard example. We flash rows and columns. This is automatically an oddball response. So if you're looking at one of these characters, then only a couple of times or infrequently you're watching at something that is flashing. So therefore, this is inherently this is an oddball paradigm evoking the P300 response, which we can then actually use to decode to which of the characters you're looking at. Rows and columns is, let's say, what we did in the early days. We can optimize actually the ordering and even the highlighting of these sequences, for instance, shown here on the right, to evoke more prominent P300 responses. Steady state evoked potentials, what we do here these days is essentially not only using frequency, but also using phase. So this speller matrix here is essentially this layout over here. So in red, you will see the different frequencies. They really go from 8 to 16 hertz in steps of 0.2 hertz. But at the same time, there's also a phase difference. Right? So this is joint frequency and phase modulation that is used these days, and this is really performing well. Like 100% performance in 500 milliseconds to 1 second. This is a really fast paradigm. Okay. And then we have the CVEP speller. And here I'm explaining the basic principles of it, like the standard CVEP speller. So again, on the left side, this would be your speller layout. And the gray cells here would actually be the A, the B, the C, the D, the E, and so forth and so on. Right? The white border is simply an added feature, but it's typically non-selectable. I'll explain why this is the case. What we typically do in a CVEP speller is we use a so-called M sequence, which is this code over here. It's a binary code where the 1 would mean a character is flashing, so the background is white, and a 0 would mean the background is black. Right? So by going up and down throughout this sequence, we're actually highlighting a specific character. Okay. Now these sequences, they actually come from telecommunication. Okay. The nice thing about it, if we circularly shift this sequence and compute the autocorrelation with time-delayed versions of the same sequence, the autocorrelation is this function. So only at a time lag of 0, where it's the same sequence, it's peaking, it's a correlation of 1. But at the other time intervals, the other latencies, the other delays, it's near 0. It's actually 1 divided by the number of bits. Right? The assumption now is that if these sequences, so the idea is actually that these time-shifted versions you actually put here in these gray cells. Right? So 0 here means that it's 0 time lag, so it's the original sequence. Then the 1 means we lag it with 1 bit. 2 means we lag it with 2 bits. Right? And this way we create multiple codes. But the idea is that they are near 0 correlated, not correlated essentially. But then hopefully the brain responses when you focus on one of these is also not correlated. Right? This is the assumption that we're making. But of course, if we actually look at the responses, how they correlate, then this is of course a bit more noisy. There's a nonlinear brain in between. But still, this might be optimal. Okay, so this is what we typically do. We take one sequence, we circularly shift it. So here you see actually the different codes for different lags. You see that there is a circular relationship. So at these time points here, they're all actually different, but they're built up of the same code simply by circularly shifting. This information we also use in the decoding. So this is a complex schematic. Essentially speaking, what we're doing is we're computing templates. So average responses to repeated stimulation of the same code. And if we do this with one code, what we can essentially do is just circularly shift these templates as well, such that we have the templates for the other codes as well. Okay, because they have this circular relationship. Now, if we have these templates, we can perform canonical correlation analysis. I'll explain this later as well, to find a spatial filter. Then during testing, essentially speaking, all we're doing is spatially filtering the new incoming data, comparing it to all the templates, and maximizing a type of similarity, for instance, correlation. So the decoding pipeline is actually very, very simple. Okay. So a little bit more about this. So essentially speaking, during training, what we're doing is we requested the participant to look at a particular sequence for multiple times. And then we simply compute averages, right? So these averages would be what I call here templates. They are in this matrix R. They will go in the, so here I actually call it T, because this will be the stacked templates for all the different trials that I have. The same I do actually with my recorded data. So I stack all my data. So this data that I have here could actually be from different trials. Just concatenated them as if they come from one specific trial. Now what the CCA is going to try to do is optimize a spatial filter and another spatial filter, one for the single trial data, one for the averaged templates. And with these spatial filters, we can compute the spatially filtered data and spatially filtered templates. And CCA is going to try to optimize these spatial filters, because these we need to learn, we don't know them, by maximizing the correlation between the two. And this you could do, of course, iteratively, gradient descent, so tune these spatial filters such that the error between these two becomes smaller. This we can do with CCA in one go, an analytical solution. There's an SVD at the background. But this is very simple. Right? This is arranging our data, computing some averages, putting it into CCA. We have our spatial filters. Right? So templates we need for the decoding by averaging, spatial filters by CCA. This scheme actually that is on the slide here, we can use for any type of evoke response BCI. Also for P300s to compute spatial filters. But there's a downside of this. So this is not at all related to what I put in my title, my ambitious title. Because we're computing averages, we require a lot of data. Right? Additionally, if we do not use such an M sequence that we circularly shift, we lose the relationship between different codes. We need to compute now the averages for each and every single code that we're presenting. So even more data is required. So what I propose is a solution to this. And the solution is to actually reduce the amount of data by looking at the structure that you actually presented. So we actually have some repeated structure in the data. So instead of averaging full single trials, what I'm going to propose is to average individual events. And events here in this domain would be the individual flashes, so responses to individual flashes. Assuming that every time that we presented a flash, regardless of where they were presented on the screen, which code was behind it, or where we are in time, we assume that the response is going to be the same, roughly. Big linearity assumption. Can we do this? Literature has shown, yes, we can do this to a certain extent. So this is the so-called linear superposition hypothesis. So the idea that the response to a sequence of events is actually the response to the edited response to the individual events. Right? So the response to a sequence of events here in blue is actually the response of the individual events. So here's an indicator function that just tells us at which point in time we have a certain event. Additive, we have two sums here for the responses to individual events. I already here prime you a little bit with one step further that actually allows a little nonlinearity. There might be different types of events. Right? So we might have different responses to different type of events. For instance, a short flash and a long flash. We'll see this later on as well. And indeed, literature has shown, this is for steady state evoked potentials. If we just show a flash at a very slow pace, such that the responses are non-overlapping, we see these transient responses. So there are these typical flash fab ERPs that we then see. N100, for instance, P100. If we start stimulating just faster, these responses start overlapping. And the fact that they start overlapping means that indeed what we see back in the brain is something like an oscillation. Right? This, if you now actually try to explain steady-state evoked potentials by simply the linear superposition of these flash fabs, this explains roughly 50 to 60% of the data. Right? So what I'm not saying essentially is that the brain is simply responding in a linear way. Only thing I'm saying is that we can approximate it with a linear system. And maybe this is sufficient for a good decoding performance. Right? So how do we do this? So again, back to the CCA. What I'm introducing now is essentially, so the top part of this figure is actually the same as I had before. So we have some training data. We know to which sequences the participant has been looking at. We simply concatenate these trials along the time dimension as if this is one big trial. So at the top, we will just learn a spatial filter for spatially filtered data. But now at the bottom, what I'm doing here is actually providing a so-called design matrix or structure matrix that tells us really when do the individual events happen that we think the brain might respond to. Now, I already primed you a little bit what we typically do. The codes that we typically present, they're different codes, they're not the AMP sequences. They're also modulated in such a way that they actually flash with only a short flash and a long flash. So we assume that the brain is somehow non-linearly responding to the short and the long flash. We could, of course, also decided to just assume that every flash is the same, but we know that this is not the case. Right? So it's this kind of sub-additive response that we see. So we fit here essentially 3 responses, 2 different flash events, short and long. And one that is simply, you can see it here, it's only at the start. So all of a sudden, the screen started flashing. This gives a huge evoke potential as well. So we can model this now as well. So what this is actually doing here, the first row over here is actually just depicting in the code, there was a flash, there was another short flash, another short flash, another short flash, and so forth and so on. Then this sort of like second submatrix here is showing us, here there was a long flash, here there was a long flash, here there was a long flash. Okay. And this one shifting down, this is actually what is typically also done with the temporal response function fitting. Right? So we're going to try to fit a kind of impulse response function for these individual events, which are depicted here. Okay. Now the idea is actually that if we compute a product between this vector and this matrix, this is something like discrete convolution. Actually, it's exactly what I showed you before in terms of the matrix that was x equals some sum of an indicator function times the responses. Okay, this is just expressed now in a matrix in a discrete way. So what the CCA will now actually start doing, because the spatial filter and the temporal filter we don't know initially, what it will start doing is it will start to spatially filter the data and predict some templates and try to optimize again the correlation between the two. Again, you can do this in a gradient descent way, which is nice for intuition building. But again, we can do this in an analytical solution. So the CCA is now actually giving us both the spatial filter and the temporal filter. And the beauty now is that we can use the temporal filters here to predict the response to any type of code that is built up of a short and a long flash. Okay, so to some extent, this is even a generative model. And the beauty is we're not anymore learning templates over full trials, which is a lot of parameters over all the samples within your trial. We're reducing it to these couple of parameters for the individual responses. And on top of that, even we have these individual flashes a lot within one trial. So at the same time, reducing the number of parameters, but we have more data to play with. And this might actually boost the performance. Good. So just a recap. So this is essentially what we're doing. So during training, if we do it in a supervised, calibrated way, we have some recording data. We simply maximize the correlation between spatially filtered data and the predicted templates, right? So remember that this R transpose D, this is essentially D where all the structure matrices, the design matrices were concatenated, and this R times M is actually the template. And so this is this discrete convolution. This is what we do during training. So we optimize the spatial filter and this response vector. During testing, if we have a new data, X, we spatially filter it, we correlate it with all of these predicted templates, and we maximize which predicted template looks most similar to the current single trial. The beauty is actually that these two formulations here, they look a lot alike. So actually our testing criterion is our training criterion, our objective function there is quite similar, if not the same as the objective function during testing. Again, this might actually mean why it's working so well. I'll show you some results later. I'm promising a lot. I'll show you some results as well. Just one step before I go into it. Even more. The only thing I'm adding here is this red character I. What I'm doing here is moving from a trained, so a supervised classifier into something that doesn't require any training. Because actually what we have been building up to so far is something where we can test which code was behind the data. Because we can now start looking for maximum explained variance. So for instance, in the speller, typically we use a 4x8 layout or 6x6. We have 32 or 36 characters, so 36 sequences, let's say. So what we can simply do now is just for all these individual sequences. So we now have already at the start, we never did training. We don't have any information, but we know that there is 36 sequences. We get our data. Now we want to find out which sequence is behind the data. So why not fit this model, this CCA, learn the spatial filters and the response vectors for each of these sequences and see how well they actually fit. So we compute the explained variance and we maximize the explained variance. Okay, so this is kind of model testing. And this we can do over time, eventually in an adaptive way, where it starts learning, accumulates data of previously classified trials. We use dynamic stopping that I won't go into right now, but the model uses a kind of certainty to know, okay, now I'm certain enough that this is my target. And now in the next trial, I can actually use that information as well, assuming, of course, that my previous classification was correct. And in that way, say the first trials will see this. The first trials might take more time. Eventually, this converges to a supervised classifier as well. So finally, what we've been waiting for, some results. So what I'm showing here is what I call E-train, and this would be this first CCA that I showed. It's only learning a spatial filter, right? So it's learning templates over single trials, performs a spatial filtering operation, and matches against a template. That's E-train. So this is the spatial filter. Notice that here we have only 8 electrodes, so this blue blob in the middle, this is just simply interpolation due to the visualization. But it's mostly that at the back of the head, occipital response, visual cortex, this is where the information is. Then we have N-train, which is essentially what I showed after it. This is where we start learning in a supervised way the temporal responses. So again, a spatial filter, but also these temporal responses. And notice this is one response for the actual onset of stimulation, and then the 2 responses that are just slightly dissimilar for the different durations of flashes, short and long. Then we have one train, which is this a little bit of a limitation already of the training data that we provide to the model. So in N-train, we give it all N classes, so data of all N classes, 36. In N-train, we limit the training data to only one class, and it has to actually generalize to all the other classes. And so this is actually providing this information, can it actually generalize? Okay. That's one train. And then we have zero train that just starts from scratch, like the last thing that I showed you. Right? So it doesn't have information at the start. To that extent, I would call it actually semi-supervised, so it's not unsupervised because it knows about the 36 classes that are there. So there's some type of label information. The actual ground truth label we don't have. Right? Each of these 3, they learn a spatial filter as well as the temporal responses. And already from these figures, we can see that they arrive at the same type of responses, given the same data and the same amount of data. Okay. Most useful is, of course, to look at the templates. What do they predict? So at the bottom here, I show one of these codes. Then what I show here is spatially filtered single trial data. And then here are the 3 different templates for this particular code for the 4 different methods. Okay, but you should notice is that they look quite alike. Okay, so actually our more condensed way of doing the decoding, I would say more efficient decoding, arrives at similar responses as the one that actually takes into account averages. That would maybe allow for nonlinearities, which we don't model. On this graph over here, focus mostly on the right one. These are the explained variances of single trials, right? So very noisy trials. And here we actually see that this ERP method that would actually maybe be the best, it's actually with the same amount of data not reaching the same explained variances. Okay, so actually with our kind of decompression, we arrive higher explained variances. And this now is also expressed in the decoding performances. So the performance of the BCI if you were to operate it. What I'm showing at the top here is essentially speaking the correctly emitted symbols over the entire session. So what I'm doing now is I'm not starting time 0 here at the point that we start using the speller for online use, spelling characters. But t equals 0 here is actually the start of this session where we start accumulating for some of the methods training data. So this is really session time. So what we see is that 0 train, of course, starts already at the start with emitting symbols. But the E-train version that has to average over all these trials needs a large bag of training data. So it starts emitting symbols only later. Then we have the supervised classifier onTrain and nTrain that start a little bit earlier and reach similar performances as the ZeroTrain. It's actually quite nice that maybe even the ZeroTrain has a steeper curve in the end because it's adaptive. Okay, so it can account for maybe non-stationarities in the data. This right plot here shows the fact that for most of the methods, so they all have a dynamic stopping procedure behind them. So trials stop at certain points in time. For the ZeroTrain, of course, we start with long trials. But after about 8 trials, we are converged to the same level, to the same performance of a supervised classifier. It even goes lower a little bit, again, because it's adaptive. So if we accumulate these in like general metrics for performance, we can actually see that the nTrain and ZeroTrain, they're performing best. Way better than this eTrain. Okay. And even beautiful is that the ZeroTrain actually performs on par with a supervised trained classifier. Okay. So with that, conclusions. So if you exploit structure in your stimulus protocol, you can do better. What I mean by this mostly, and this is not necessarily what I talked about here, but will be presented as a poster, you can actually optimize these stimuli to yield the best responses. Okay, so maybe we shouldn't take codes from the telecommunication domain, but actually try to optimize the codes in such a way that they are optimal in terms of their responses. At the same time, explore the structure in the data. So if you know that you can make these event decompositions, and maybe we haven't found yet the best event decomposition, so now we're looking at short and long flashes, but maybe we need something else. You can actually reduce the number of model parameters, increase actually the number of repetitions that you can use for these model parameters, and with that, achieve very high performances. And this eliminates the need for training data. So we can start the session right away. And it generalizes to unseen data to that extent. Okay. For those interested, the entire analysis pipeline is now pip installable. So for those that want to test it out on their own data, feel free to do so. Of course, this is not work that I did myself. So Michael Tangeman, Sarah Amadi, but also before the former BCI lab, Peter de Saan, Jason Farquhar, Peter Marsman, and Philip van der Broek. The quick primer on posters, there's 2 related to this work. One is about dynamic stopping and one about testing these more optimal sequences. Thank you.
Volleyball.
Thanks, Jody. It's a very nice presentation. So one thing about your assumption that the longer visual stimuli contribute to decoding. Can you say something about that? Because I think neurophysiologically, the strongest response is to a change. Yeah. And so you would get an initial response, a beep when the light goes on, and when it goes off, you get another brain response. So yeah. How does the length benefit your decoding?
That's a very good question. So I'm repeating it maybe, or is that microphone also recorded in the online session? Yeah. Oh, okay, that's good. So just going through these results. So the difference is also very small. This is one thing that we see. So we do see if we try to decode with, let's say, an event model that only codes for, let's say, the start of a flash. So treats every flash as an individual event is suboptimal. So we have to sort of dissociate. Then we can make a distinction between indeed modeling long versus short. So really the duration, which in terms of brain dynamics is maybe not what we respond to. Think about the limit. We present a flash, a flash that is just on, so not really a flash, just a light that goes on, doesn't go off. We respond to the flanks, right? In between, there's not really a response anymore. And indeed, in the underlying work, actually, here we tested a couple of these different models. So one that would actually decode according to a contrast. So fit a model for the uprising flank and the downrising flank. And it performed equally well, but only on this data set where we have only 2 events. Now we have some preliminary work where we have the original sequences. So our sequences, if you look here, they really build up of 2 events. So here, short, 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 long, short, long. But the original codes, they actually have like 6 different lengths. And these we're now using to see whether indeed we can actually decode better with this duration event, or whether we can start modeling with these flanks. And it seems indeed, preliminary results, that we can explain actually these duration responses with just the two on and off responses. And that again would actually limit the number of parameters. Right? It limits the number of parameters to only 2 responses instead of, for instance, the 6 responses, the 6 durations. At the same time, I am sort of like claiming that I can generalize to all kinds of codes, but this model actually can only generalize to codes that have these 2 durations. If I have a 3rd duration, I don't know what the response is. If I were to now use actually the on and off response, I can generalize to any response, any code, any binary code. Yeah. Good throwing.
Hey, thanks for the great talk. So you, although you didn't detail, but you did mention that you're using a certain stopping criterion. But you also, like, your sessions clearly start at a certain point. Mm-hmm. Is there also a starting criterion? Like, if you were to imagine this being used in a real life scenario, then like in the morning when you put on your EEG cap, that's not necessarily the starting point. Mm-hmm. So would there also, have you considered also like a starting criterion to figure out like when should the system be engaged and start training?
Yeah, so there is actually 2 things I think that we can sort of highlight here. So I'm now saying session phone. So maybe just historically speaking, we started out in the BCI field reporting accuracies. But then we wanted to compare BCIs and we thought, okay, now we also need to take into account decoding time at test time, number of classes of this pattern. So we converged to information transfer rate. Now I'm saying, but wait a second, we also have training. The model that has the same, let's say, testing parameters, number of classes and these type of things, that has a shorter training time, has to be preferred over one that has a long training time. But now, I mean, what is a session? Maybe it should include also the time that it took to put on the cap. So maybe we have a more practical cap. So that time should also be incorporated. We start incorporating more and more and more. Now, I don't think necessarily this was your question. Your question was about dynamic stopping. We typically apply at the testing time. So we have a new trial and we stop at a certain time that we're certain. But actually this you could also, of course, apply to the training. So start accumulating more and more data, training data, until you think I'm now certain enough that the model that I have trained so far can now be used in an online BCI. This typically is not necessarily done, but I think you could do it because we see that for some participants, we maybe need only 20 seconds of training data, and for some others, 20 minutes. 20 minutes, that's a lot. Anyway, there's variance in the training data that is needed. And I think you could apply definitely these methods.
Okay. Do you think there's a specifically suitable background brain state? I mean, Robert mentioned like early in the morning maybe not be a good time point to achieve strong evoked responses. I don't know, maybe after the first coffee. So do you have an idea, like, are there fluctuations of maybe the amplitude or the signal to noise that you can decode with this approach? And if so, do you have any ideas of the underlying factors that could influence it? Because that could then maybe, if we are able to monitor the brain state over time and say like, oh, now is a suitable brain state to start using this tool. Think about patients that are locked in. Sometimes they may even be asleep and it's hard for us to recognize that now we cannot work with them, right? So we first of all need to look for awake sleep cycles before we can do something. But that's a more clear-cut case, I think.
Yeah. So maybe to make the distinction, so what we're using mostly in steady state evoked potentials and code modulated visual evoked potentials is a very early sensory response. Contrasted to, for instance, in the P300 pattern, right? There's a kind of cognitive task to it. So I would expect to a lesser extent that certain mental states are actually involved. Still, I mean, if you can spend more attention fixating at your target and ignoring all the others, I think that would benefit the decoding. So you have a higher SNR. At the same time, I believe actually there's some results on that individual component still of the flash fab. Some might actually be related to attention. So can be manipulated by more or less attention. Some others actually not. So they would be there even if you just simply stare at the screen. But in general, of course, if you operate such a BCI, there is some attention needed, right? Because you need to focus on the target that you want to select. So maybe indeed before the coffee in the early morning, maybe it's not the greatest. Can we test it with this system? I mean, the thing that you of course see is maybe a better or worse decoding. So again, maybe this stopping procedure actually during training would tell you, okay, we didn't find a very good decoding model right now, so maybe it's not the best time to do it now. Or maybe just ignore that data set and try it again.
Okay, I think we're good. So our next speaker is Nick Ramsey. He's a professor of cognitive neuroscience and works at the University Hospital de UMC in Utrecht. Thank you for being here.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me. It's always fun to talk about a topic that you're really interested in, as I think many will agree. I'm going to try to manipulate this. I never work with a mouse, so I might be all over the place. I don't know. I'll figure it out. Anyway, so I'm going to talk about implantable BCI technology. I'm not going to compare or argue anything, but that's just where I come from. I started my career in animal research and quickly decided that that was not something I wanted to do too long because it's animals. And I went to the US and I got involved in PET scanning, functional MRI, the beginning of it. I'm that old, 1992. But then moved back to the Netherlands to use functional MRI in psychiatry to try to understand what's wrong in the brains of schizophrenics, which we never found out basically. But and then I got interested because a neurosurgeon said, well, if you know so much about functional topography, can you help out with my patients? So he does awake surgeries and he wants to know which parts of the brain he can or cannot remove. And by waking the patient up during the surgery, you can stimulate, which is a virtual lesion, and that will tell you whether removal of that part of the brain is going to have a consequence for movement or for language. That was the most important one. We actually found out, a little anecdote, he once called me, he said, well, I have this patient and he has a frontal problem causing epilepsy, and a Polish guy, and can you test him? Working memory, classical working memory, dorsolateral prefrontal cortex on the left. And I said, okay, well, we'll do an fMRI scan. And I told him, you shouldn't remove that. But he's a surgeon and they think the frontal lobe is expendable. That's by experience, because you have two of them, so it seems to be okay. And he, after the surgery, he called me in, he said, oh, come and test the patient, he's doing fine. So I go test the patient, and the surgeon says, "Well, he's everything is fine," because I asked him, "What did you have for breakfast this morning?" Yeah. Was it a sandwich with cheese? Yeah. So I said, "Okay, fine." So I tested him. He had zero working memory. He could not even remember the instructions for a simple NBAC test. Absolutely nothing. So that made me realize that we kind of bring something to the table for neurosurgery, but they still remove that area anyway because of the disease. Anyway, so that's where I come from, and I got exposed or involved in ECOG for epilepsy patients, which is a technique where electrodes are implanted because the patient doesn't respond to medication. EEG doesn't tell you where the source of seizures is. So they put a grid in, 24/7 monitoring, because it's all very vulnerable, so they have to stay in bed, which is extremely expensive. That's 3 shifts of nurses and technicians, which is expensive. But that allowed me to conduct research, fMRI, compare it to ECOG, and that's what brought me to the point where I said, well, this should be applicable. If we understand so much, we understand so much of the ECOG, then we should be able to apply it for people who have a urgent need, which is people with locked-in state. So that's what I'm going to talk about now, and partly about our own work. And I have a list of items I will present to you. First is the why. Why do we do this? What's the relevance of doing this, pretty invasive procedure? How we do this? What kind of information has led up to where we are now? Then I'll talk about the neuroprosthesis project in Utrecht that we started in 2008. And then I'll move on towards decoding speech, which is very much in the news these days. A couple of months ago, there's a couple of Nature papers, which I'll go into a little bit detail in the end. And then a little bit about how what I see as the trajectory from research on BCI implants all the way to making it work for people who need a solution that cannot be offered otherwise. So, locked-in syndrome. So I will show you a movie. I keep scouring the internet for movies that that explain what I want to get across. This is an ALS patient in the US, and she explains what it means to have ALS. And ALS has a life expectancy of 3 to 5 years after diagnosis. Diagnosis is where you already have significant problems with deliberate movements. People pass away because their respiration quits. Most people choose to leave it that way, to step out of life in a natural way. But some people want to stay alive, and there's an increasing number of people who want to stay alive because there's improved possibilities to get respiration very safe at home, and there's increasing chances of not getting locked in. Those are the two main reasons for people to choose not to have mechanical ventilation, which means surgery and a stoma right here. It's a little bit American, but I think the story is very well explained. If I get it to work.
At 38 years of age, with an infant son and a bright future ahead, Army nurse Sandy Steuben learned she had an incurable disease, ALS, better known as Lou Gehrig's disease. Doctors gave her 3 years to live.
ALS is a myotrophic lateral sclerosis, and it is a progressive neurological disease which eventually takes over the entire nervous system.
Dr. Pamela Harmon is an expert in adaptive technology and one of Sandy's doctors.
It affects motor skills. The patient ends up being trapped within the body, which progressively doesn't work, and the mind is fine.
Rather than sink into despair, Sandy refused to surrender. She turned to VA for the specialized care needed to battle her debilitating illness. That was 12 years ago.
I began receiving my care at the VA in 1998, after being medically retired from active duty. I was nervous, and I didn't know what to expect. The medical center definitely surprised me with their incredible support and the professionalism of their staff.
That support has enabled Sandy to live a productive, rewarding life, and she's far exceeded her doctor's initial expectations.
She's very bright and she's very flexible, and that, more than anything else, really, that and her strength are remarkable because it's allowed her to maintain a presence in the family, in her son's life, certainly.
But inevitably, Sandy's disease has taken its toll. Now almost completely paralyzed, she communicates with others through this adaptive computer system, operating it with one of the few muscles she can still control, her cheek.
And this is the muscle detector, and you have it on with a sticky pad on the skin surface, and it will read the muscle movement and send it directly to the computer.
And her computer also has word prediction, so Sandy doesn't have to type entire words. She can also store phrases and paragraphs to use again.
Now everything can be done online. Instant messaging lets me talk in real time. I can text my son. I am completely independent when I am on the computer.
Sandy has used this advanced technology to write an inspirational book, an autobiography titled The Butcher's Daughter, the story of an Army nurse with ALS.
I decided I could use myself as an example to help others with any of life's challenges.
Through VA-provided programs like telehealth and home-based care, Sandy receives most of her care at home, care that's provided by the dedicated staff of Washington, D.C.'s VA Medical Center.
I would say Sandy Steuben is probably the most extraordinary person that I have known in my lifetime.
And Sandy is determined to help other paralyzed patients and those who care for them. Along with her book, she contributes to medical journals, is active in an online support group for ALS patients.
So she can still communicate with a muscle. A lot of people can, and nowadays there's eye trackers. This is a little bit older movie, but at some point people lose the ability to do that. And what I wanted to get across is she wanted to live to see her son grow up. And a lot of the ALS patients that are responding to our recruitment activities for implants, they have small children. And the one I'll talk about a little bit, she was implanted in 2015. She just got her grandchild, and she's ecstatic, but right now she can't communicate anymore. So eventually, even a BCI is probably not going to work in ALS, but we can span this period that they want to make the most out of their lives. So that's what we do this for. So what's locked-in syndrome? Classically, it's associated with brainstem stroke. That's the neurologist's point of view. But for the last 20 years, it's recognized that neuromotor diseases can lead to the exact same phenomenological disorder, which is locked-in syndrome, locked-in state. You're capable of thinking and wishing and responding emotionally to your environment, wanting to participate in social activities, but there's no muscle that you can control, so there's no way that you can communicate. Now, in the course of this presentation, there's basically two stages that we can look at. One is lifting people out of a locked-in state, of preventing locked-in by giving them a simple but highly reliable click control. It uses scanning software, basically what Sandy was using. She uses a muscle to click through menus, which requires the computer to highlight text, which you'll see. But the second thing that they would really like is real-time social interaction, responding to their families and their friends in real time, which is extremely difficult if you use assistive technology. So that's where the need or the desire to decode speech in real time comes from. And real time, it can be a few seconds, maybe 5 seconds at most, to express a sentence. When we go to talk to families with locked-in patients, it's extremely difficult for them to engage, because by the time with their eye tracker they've formulated a sentence to respond on something that's discussed, the topic has passed. So it's very unrewarding. So that's why we really want to decode speech. Anyway, so cognition is intact for most of the time. Most people with ALS risk some level of dementia at some point. Like I said, the cause is brainstem stroke or severe trauma, neuromotor disease. The quality of life, and very few people would predict this, is very high for these people. There's been multiple studies in France. For some reason, there's very active locked-in community, and they found out that if you ask people who are locked in, have been locked in for a while, they will rate their quality of life as 7 on a scale of 1 to 10. Holland, being the happiest country in the world for a couple of years in a row, is something like 7.5. I won't go into that, why that is, but people really like it, as opposed to their caregivers who think that their quality of life is 4, level 4, and neurologists even less. So, makes you think. Most important for the quality of life is communication and independence. It's like Sandy said, I'm fully independent. Of course, that's not quite true. Someone needs to attach everything, but she has privacy and she can activate interactions on the internet. Now, the brain-computer interface, very basic principle is you record signals from the brain, and Jordi just nicely showed some of the EEG methods. That goes into a signal acquisition system, an amplifier, and that does the processing. I'm not going to talk about decoding algorithms. That's translated into an instruction for different actuators, which could be a computer, a wheelchair. What some labs are working on is re-engaging the muscles. There's a company, there's a group in Geneva, and they reactivate instructions to the spine so people can walk again. There's one case actually here in Utrecht that was presented about half a year ago. So the target population now is people who are locked in severe, to get them out, because there's no other way. If that little muscle doesn't work anymore, then they don't have any other way. So these are small numbers. We think the number of people in Holland is about 150, 170 that would benefit from this at this point. But as see. As we go forward and we get better and better, if you can imagine that you can regenerate or recover some mobility by stimulating the muscles or speech, you're talking about much larger numbers of people who have limited quality of life because partial paralysis, they can't speak very well. It's, undignified trauma and cerebral palsy. So those are much larger numbers that we're talking about. So moving into the implant field, there's two fields that are converging as of this year. And one is the needle, the single unit recording. I always lose my voice, but I'll survive. That started in the 50s with some single unit in animal biology. And if you see at the top, this is all that. Monkey controls a neuron. Eb Fetz in Seattle, he was the first to report that a monkey could actually regulate activity of a single neuron, provided it was given feedback and some reward. Then they've got a rat to move. The robot arm in 99. The first human was implanted with a UTI array, which is this tiny bed of needles that you see at the top. And then this year, the first time that they moved into the speech field, they showed this decoding of speech. Completely different field is from medicine. So Penfield is the first one to report on the use of electrodes on the brain. Penfield is a neurosurgeon. Later, these signals were identified as being informative about neural activity. Moving forward, the first BCI brain click implant was shown to work in Utrecht. And then here and here, using more electrodes, experimental techniques, but still on the surface. You can see the picture at the bottom is a silicon sheet with the electrodes embedded. Getting more electrodes in there, you can get more decoded information. So, and what I'll end up with is both their results presented in Nature this year. But I just want to show that they have a completely different line of background, very different interest. The single units were very much interested in robotic arms. The ECOG has mainly been interested in communication. So a little bit, probably everyone knows, but I'll just go there anyway, how much we've learned. Oh, I appreciate it. Thank you.
Okay, that's fine.
Yeah, good. 1810s, this is phrenology, which is, everybody laughs about it, but the concept that different brain parts were performing different roles was quite innovative at the time. They just didn't have the techniques to look in the brain. 1910, First World War, shrapnel, grenades, very fine lesions, and people start to map out very specific lesions with cognitive deficits, the start of neuropsychology. And then 2010, functional MRI, this is a 7 Tesla. It allows you to image activity without having to go into the brain. So we've moved forward quite a lot. Now there's 3 electrophysiological techniques that I can mention, and I haven't included MEG, but so EEG, electrodes at the surface. I compare that to sitting all the way in the back of a music hall or a theater hall, and you try to see the play. You can get the play, but you can't see much of the details. So you know something is happening. They go to ECOG, which is these discs. Each disc records about somewhere between 100 and 500,000 neurons in one electrode. So you're sitting, I think, in a sweet spot because you can see the play, you can still see the individuals. But then there's the UTI array or the single cell recordings is all the way in front. Very difficult to see the whole event. You only see a tiny part of the brain, although an incredible amount of money is extracted from it. So just to compare them. It will pass. I'm sorry. So ECOG is what I'm focused on. We chose that partly because of what I told you, my background in moving into epilepsy. recording, but also because it's a proven technology in terms of safety to the brain. The Utah array, it triggers when that first response of the brain, it gets encapsulated, the brain actually eats away part of the electrodes, and it has a very limited longevity. In general, for the research that's currently being done, it's okay because according to the FDA, you have to explant it after 6 months, or maybe it can be extended up to a few years, but then you explant it and the patient goes home without taking with them the benefit. For us, because we work with locked-in patients, we want to have a system that will work for 10 years. You don't want to have people come in every few years because the electrode is no longer functioning. So that's a very simple thing. And, you know, as a carpenter, you know your own hammer, so I know how to process these data. So, but most of the data are collected from patients with epilepsy. But just to show you, already in 2006, we found 2 adjacent electrodes with 1 centimeter apart would give extremely different responses. And most of the information is captured in the broadband high frequency, so-called high frequency band, which is between 50 or 60 hertz and up to 150. Beyond that, the power is very low. It doesn't contribute too much. You just average that, and it's a measure of neural activity in those 500,000 neurons. They just add up. It's noise. It's an increase in noise. And if you look at the power over time, and this is a task where this person needed to solve very simple equations, 1 + 1 = 2, to middle complex, to very difficult, where you had to manipulate 3 of them. So in one electrode, you can see very brief responses. This is the simplest, in the middle and the hardest. And in another electrode, you get a very different response. So it seems that they kick in the later part. The first is more of the initial part of the process. The electrode next to it is more of the real working memory part. Just as an illustration. Funny enough, those patients with implants are not enough. So I've been working with functional MRI for a long time. We have a 7 Tesla scanner, a group that really knows how to make the machine sing, so to say. And we use the neurovascular coupling principle. That means that where neural activity increases extremely locally, the blood flow increases and the blood dynamics increase. And we use that correlation we've investigated to analyze or investigate potential targets for implantable BCIs. Just to make you appreciate it, this is the scanner. On the right, it's the images that go to neurosurgery for the purposes. But in the middle, you can see 3 curves, which are pixels or voxels that are adjacent to each other within the gray matter. And this is a different time response for each of the electrodes, depending on how deep in the gray matter they are. And we're talking about 3 millimeter distance between them, just to give you the sense of detail. And then just one slide, we did quite some work to figure out whether we can actually rely on the 70 fMRI to determine our path for implantable BCIs. These are patients with an experimental grid. The standard clinical grids have 1 centimeter distance between electrodes because it's more like a GPS for the neurologist to find the source of the seizure. They don't need that much detail. But this is experimental with 3 millimeter between electrodes. It's quite safe because it's the same technology of manufacturing. And we did the same patient. We did have him do a task in the 7T scanner, and the centers of activity for 3 fingers, little finger, index, and the thumb, is displayed here. So basically, this tiny grid is positioned here, and you can see that for the thumb, the blue is ECOG, the red is fMRI. So for each finger, those are really close to each other. So not only do they agree with each other, but they both have a spatial level of detail that we can utilize, because you don't want to have a large coverage. You want to have a small coverage for BCI with a maximum amount of information to be obtained from that. So brain topography is what we use. So basically, almost all of the BCI implants are targeting the sensory-motor cortex. There's a lot of good reasons for this. One, the signal is whopping because it's a signal associated with long nerves. Second, it's highly detailed and it has a lot of space. So you all know the homunculus, this picture, there's a huge area representing the face and the hand, the ones that I'm actually using the most right now, so there's a good reason for that. And the third reason is that you don't want to be able to decode an intention or a thought, which I don't think we can, but you don't want to decode an intention because much of what makes us human is inhibition of impulsive responses. There's nothing worse than a system that will pop out something that you didn't want to say, but you thought it anyway. So all these come together and everybody focuses on sensory motor cortex. Now, for primates who already know a huge amount of detail, these are patches with single cell recordings, different digits represented in multiple patches in this very small part. We see the same in human. This is the although there's not much single cell recordings in humans other than the implants with the Utah array that are being done for BCI. But we know this is the hand knob from many studies with fMRI. This is a 70s study where you display the patches of cortex that respond to movement of single fingers. The colors correspond. You can appreciate that all the fingers are in this area. There's multiple centers. There's the motor areas, sensory areas, and as we learn, there's multiple topographical maps for both in both cortices, as there are in the visual cortex. The mouth area, the face area, has been formally reported for the first time in 2013, and that's because fMRI is not that easy to uncover the topographical organization. The surgeons always thought, well, with stimulation, it's all over the place, so there's no topography. But it's only when a group in San Francisco worked with BCIs to try to decode speech that they discovered that there's some organization here. And these are different articulators. So this is the larynx, there's the tongue. I can't even see it that well, but these four are larynx, the tongue, the jaw, and the lips. And they have separate representation on the cortex. So that allows you to think about decoding. Just to allow you to appreciate the spatial detail, for those of you that work with humans, that might be surprised. That work with animals is no surprise because they have tiny brains and there's a lot of detail. But I was surprised and the surgeons were surprised. This is a grid, 3 millimeters, placed on the face area right here. It's a little bit difficult to see. This is a CT scan to show you where the electrodes are after implant. And they stimulate across electrodes. And stimulation is what is done by the neurologists to find out, like I said, with surgeries, the wake surgeries, they can do that in these patients to find out which areas the surgeon should absolutely not remove. And so they have kind of a roadmap. If the seizure source, the area of source of seizures, is in those or near those area, the people go home without a surgery, which is usually very dramatic because there's no other option. They stimulate, and what happens is that if you stimulate with alternating current for a few seconds, you get a very slow contraction of a muscle. With TMS, you get, you flick of the thumb, but with electrical stimulation, you don't, because you're stimulating only the gray matter underneath the electrode. So it's always bipolar stimulation. So the red one is the same, but there's three combinations of bipolar. One is electrode to the top, an electrode to the right, electrode to the left. So we're talking about exploring a circle of 6 millimeter diameter, right? Now we'll see what happens to our participant. So there's nothing he can do about it. It's drawn clearly to the left. And the third. So you can appreciate that in this tiny patch, you can just by accident because of how the grid will locate it, but you're capable of addressing separate muscles within the tongue, which is only a small part of your facial muscle group. So this is the Utrecht project. We, 2005, started getting involved, or I started getting interested in BCI as one of the first humans was implanted with the Utah array, like I showed you earlier. And ended up in 2015 implanting a first candidate, and then 2018 and 2019, 2 more candidates. In total, we implanted 3 patients with a system that was really geared towards proving that what we think we know about BCI and brain function can actually help people that are in need and that don't have any other solution available. So rather than trying to make multi-class decoding capabilities and everything, we wanted to have something that the patient would take home and that she could use in her daily life, and that would be a brain click, very straightforward, highly reliable brain click. So this was the principle. We would identify the hand area with fMRI. The surgeon would drill a hole, place electrodes on top, close the hole, and then take the lead under the skin to a device here, which was available, an experimental device that we helped Medtronic develop to meet our needs, but it was developed for Parkinson's for different reasons, but it served our needs quite well. So the system is completely implanted. The unit here amplifies and transmits the signal wirelessly, so you don't have anything coming out of the skin. And what for our participants was extremely important, you can't see anything on the outside, absolutely nothing. So they don't look even more weird than they do because of the disease. So just to make you appreciate the kind of signals that we're dealing with, what you see here is the electrode grids. On the left, the location, on the right, the schematic of it. And what you're seeing is at each point in time, during a rest condition, the patient not doing anything, the power in this high frequency band. So basically a very strong correlate of the number of neurons firing within a frame of time. And you can see that it's extremely noisy. And within this, we need to extract meaningful information that's associated with it. Trying to move, which increase neural activity, high frequency band power in a specific part of the hand area of the motor cortex. So robust, that was the key. So basically, once the subject moves the finger, you get more noise in the patch of cortex that's responsible for moving the finger. Trying to move it and not being able to move it gives you the exact same brain signal strength. Then we basically convert that into moving of a cursor or for a click, where if there's accumulating evidence of sustained high frequency band power in that electrode, we turn it into a click with which the person can click through menus. Now for Hanneke, who's our first candidate, and she's still implanted, for her it took about 1 second to between wanting to make a click and the click being executed. So it's not that bad. So woman, 58 years old, ALS since 2008. She's care at home. Most ALS patients stay at home. The family is willing to take care of them 24/7 in this case. Invasive ventilation that requires proof of permanent monitoring. There always has to be someone within walking reach of the patient if the respiration machine gives the alarm. We did all the research at the home. She only came to the hospital for the surgery and for 1 or 2 checkups. And I wanted to show you this. This is a movie that was made by the journal, and that it explains quite well how the system works, and it saves me a little bit of time.
Patients with brainstem strokes or degenerative disorders, such as amyotrophic lateral sclerosis or ALS, can develop locked-in syndrome. They have normal cognition but are unable to move or speak owing to the loss of voluntary muscle control. Patients with locked-in syndrome can sometimes communicate using a letterboard or a camera that tracks eye movements to allow the selection of items on a computer screen, but often can only answer closed-ended questions by blinking their eyes. The ability to communicate has been associated with higher quality of life, but existing systems are very limiting, and certain light conditions make eye tracking difficult. In this brief report, investigators present the case of a 58-year-old woman with late-stage ALS and locked-in syndrome, who received a brain implant that allows her to independently communicate using typing software. Subdural electrode strips were placed over the hand region of the left motor cortex to detect the neuroelectrical signals generated when the patient tries to move her right hand. The electrodes are connected to a subcutaneously placed amplifier and transmitter in the left thoracic region that transmits signals wirelessly to a tablet device. The tablet separates activated brain signal from background electrical activity to translate cortical signals into control signals for several computer tasks. The algorithm and parameters of the decoding software were tested and optimized as the patient practiced activating her motor cortex, learning to regulate the magnitude and timing of the brain's signal. The patient performed 44 spelling runs for training and was able to type at the equivalent of 2 letters per minute with nearly 90% accuracy. 7 months after electrode implantation, she used the implanted brain-computer system at home for 32 days and for 86 minutes per day on average. Thus, the implanted brain-computer system shows that autonomous communication is possible for a patient with ALS and the locked-in syndrome. The full
So, like the journal wanted to publish, this is a clinical journal, and they wanted to publish it because this is the first time that it actually shows that the person wants to use it at home. So our metric of success was the number of hours per day that she was using the system. There's no other metric. Most of or a lot of assistive technologies, not implants, but just assistive, are exposed to the abandonment phenomenon, where people get it, doesn't work very well, they stop using it. And with an implant, of course, you can't really afford abandonment, so it has to work very well. So this is the implant. There's electrode placed based on the fMRI. We can only attach 2 of these strips of 4 electrodes. This is her tracheostomy and a device underneath the skin on the chest. So the signal, again, robustness was the key. This is the power frequency spectrum. So you see in in black, you see during rest, there's this bump in the higher frequencies and a drop in the lower frequencies. We go up to this. So the red is the high frequency band that I just talked about. And we just capture all the frequencies in the lower frequency band. So we get 2 values, and they anti-correlate always, almost always in the cortex. So if you subtract the 2 from each other at each point in time, you get a control signal, this one, which is very strong. And that's really necessary to avoid what we call false positives, that is selections that the person doesn't want to make. And we had a level of minimum 80% correct. And if I give you a keyboard and it's 80% correct, you will not be using it for more than 5 minutes. If you imagine every 5th keystroke either is missed or something else comes in, it drives you nuts. So in the end, we went to 95% correct. And that was something that the user was comfortable with. So this is how she used it. And you can appreciate the scanning, the nature of the scanning software, and it also explains why we could only get 2 or 3 letters per minute. She has word completion, she has sentences that she can select. But the principle of scanning means that most of the time you're waiting for it to move on to the selection or the choice that you want to make. So that's a limiting factor, because she could make highly distinguishable clicks every 3 seconds. So there's inherent limitation in this technique. So like I said, the amount of time that she uses it was key. It's implanted here. This is 7.5 years later. She's still implanted. And here she could still use an eye tracker. This is 24 hours per day, 0 hours per day, 12. And as her eyes started to fail her, it became more and more unreliable. She started using the system more up to here. And she said, well, I want to use it at night, which gave us a huge headache because the decoders, they go on 1,000 times at night because the brain signal is completely different. We're in the middle of investigating that. But we managed to get a wake up decoder. So the system would shut down and it would only activate when she woke up. It took her 1.5 minutes to do this. That's because the brain signal is so rich and noisy. And when it wake up, she could control the system as she wanted. And then she even chose to have a resurgery to replace the battery, which is basically the whole amplifier. to make sure that she would have it available. Unfortunately, the night decoder started to fail, and because her brain signal became even more unstable, and we never managed to get a proper decoder, so they stopped using it. And at this point, she stopped using it altogether because we just don't get a brain signal anymore. That's one of the things that we just don't understand. Anyway, so we had a second implant. It was a person with brainstem stroke. It was successful, but she took 6 seconds for a click, and we found out that her brainstem damage caused a huge increase in fluctuation in low frequencies. And that also disrupted the high frequency information. So we had to gather more information, so 6 seconds. But she was still able to use eye tracker and a couple of switches. So after 2 years, she said, yeah, thanks for the research. And a third, also in ALS patients, we worked with him, but from the beginning, he declined really fast. And we had a very hard time to have enough time to build a decoder. He could use the decoder, but at some point, by the time we wanted to see if he could use it at home, he no longer could communicate in any other way, and we had to assume that he was no longer aware, cognitively aware. So this kind of gives you the consequences of working with very vulnerable people, and you discover stuff that nobody knows because you're the first ones to implant them for a long time. And it turns out that we really doing things that nobody else did, and we just don't understand how it works. Are these the first and the third? Are they cognitively impaired, so they cannot generate an intentional to move, or is the brain atrophy is huge? Within a few years, they lose about 1 centimeter of circumference, or even more. Is that the cause of inability to generate a high frequency band signal? We really just don't know. So, significant benefit possible. The signals are highly stable. Calibration is not necessary on a daily or weekly basis. We went by once a year to see if we could improve the calibration, which would, improve the decoding performance, but that not really necessary. We're not the only ones to report that. It's quite affordable. I say that because now the last part of my talk, I'll talk about much more advanced systems, but my huge worry is that they're not going to be affordable for the ordinary person that wants to, see their kids grow up for at least a couple of years. So it's affordable. It's a very basic system and a very minimal surgery. Actually, minimal surgery doesn't mean anything. It's only a hole in the skull. So the less good is the decoders. They really fail at night. There's multiple groups that are starting to look in it. Most of the groups that do research with implants, mainly in the US, there's about 45 patients implanted with Utah array or have been implanted. There's probably at least 10 or 15 in research now, but they never do research at night because the people come into the lab to conduct research with the engineers and the scientists, but they're research participants. They don't get the system to work at home. The click speed varies greatly, and we don't quite understand it. Some people have actually tell us that it takes them a couple of seconds before they feel that an intention is built up in the cortex. We hope that they can relearn that because they've been paralyzed. And like I said, the brain signal tends to decline in ALS, something we really don't understand. So decoding speech is the holy grail. It's not based, but the Chan group in San Francisco. He's a surgeon with a large research program. They described the topography of the face area. We've been doing research to find out where the information is to distinguish the articulators. So patients move their different facial muscles one after the other, and the decodability is 90%, which is extremely high. And the information seems to be at the lower end of the cortex or the tongue. Up, down, left, right is 82%, and that also seems to be in the same area. So if you have a grid on this area, you should be good in terms of trying to decode intended speech based on articulators of the face. You can even decode emotions. The person can mimic or imagine a movement of the face as happy or sad, which we think is extremely important for BCI, because you can decode this in between 1 and 2 seconds, which means that you give the user at least a little bit of immediacy in communicating, because what people like most is to express their like or dislike for something that's being discussed. So the two fields, like I said in the beginning, are converging. So the ECOG field has been working on speech decoding and everything for the last 15 years, has culminated in a idea about what would be ideal for a BCI, which in this case is a grid with over 200 electrodes on the face area. The people from the single unit recordings come from biology. They're still very much into research, a little less in application, but they switched, they put their Utah arrays in the face area, the same area, hoping to get some accomplishment, and they also get very good results. So these are the two papers that were published, and I wrote the use and views on the content. This is the ECOG group. They have used their accomplishment was that they could decode 78 words per minute. Now, using machine learning techniques at different levels, this number becomes a little bit unclear, but let's assume it's a good estimate of what's going to happen. The Willett group, Stanford, they had 2 Utah arrays, the tiny little beds, and they got to 60 words a minute, but their vocabulary was larger and this one was smaller. So on average, my take is that you can get 60 words per minute decoded, which is only half of the speed that we normally talk. So this is one of the movies that they made with the grid. You can see the pedestal. There's no implants that can accommodate that kind of number of channels. So it's a electrodes implanted with a wire to connector, and here you see the connector on the top with wires that go to an external amplifier. This is not used for home. These patients can still utter sounds, they can still move a little bit. Like I said, in the US, they prefer to work with people that are more mobile and still capable, while in Europe we think more of, we'll do the research, but also want to give something to that we work with. So you can see her mouth a little bit. They didn't record the sound very well, but she makes some sounds, but she moves the muscles a bit. That generates sensory information on the somatosensory cortex that contributes to the decoding. We don't know how much. But this is what what the system can generate. So it takes a couple hours or a couple of days of training with a large vocabulary where she generates the signals to feed the recursive neural network, so that it can decode as what you see now is the decoding. So it's pretty fast and pretty good. So what they do, I'm not going to go in great detail, but they actually have 3 ways of decoding. So they decode speech, or brain to text, what you just saw. They also try to do brain to sound. That's a different decoding. You use the audio output of speech to map the brain signals on. And they also did some articulator gestures to try to decode facial expressions that accompany the speech. But by far the most important is the speech to text, for which they used, as the other group did, a RNN to map the brain signals onto phones or phonemes, and then they formed words, but then they used a large language model from ChatGPT kind of applications to correct many mistakes that were made in decoding the phones and the words. So basically, this is the principle: brain signal, an RNN, and then you identify which of the phonemes are most likely generated. You put it into a CTC beam search. I have no idea what it is. I apologize. From there, you get the most likely sentence. So you can see that there's corrections as the sentence are produced. Second group with the Utah arrays. So move some of the muscles in the face.
I don't have a lot of time to do it. When I'm up here.
You can appreciate that's a huge advance over the brain flicks that I talked about.
I enjoy them while
So this is the future. This is these are the two arrays, 64 points per array, and this is 4 by 4 millimeters, so you can appreciate the tiny patch of cortex that's addressed. They did use fMRI to optimize their location of it. They had 2 of these in the Broca's area, which is the higher order for speech production, but they didn't get any decoding there, which kind of supports my feeling that that kind of information is not there. It's actually the sensory motor cortex is your display of what you're trying to communicate to the outside world. And these are the different patterns. They had the person move all kinds of different parts of the face, and you can appreciate that there's different patterns of activity in the electrodes that allows you to use these patterns to decode intended speech. So just the final few slides. We've been talking about research, and what we find is that when it gets in the press that speech is decoded, basically journalists say, well, the problem is solved. It's just a matter of some company picking it up and making it fly for the patient. It's not true. So these are the levels or the stages that you go through to bring something that you find in the research lab into the patient's home. Target regions, this is all neuroscience, engineering, for the electrodes, math and AI to decode the signals. That's where we are most of the time. And the studies I just showed you, that's where they are. The second is a safe implant. That's a whole different story. That's extremely difficult. There's thousands of implants that engineers have made and shown posters of and published papers, but none of them are safe for humans. And if they're made safe for humans, they're not affordable. It's a different discussion, but so far it doesn't necessarily look that we're going to have an implantable amplifier anywhere soon. So is it safe? The BCI performance, is it good enough for the user? Is that person happy other than the scientist? Then you get to the third level. Okay, what kind of benefit can you bring to a user? Like I said, most people with paralysis have some means of communicating or controlling machines. A BCI implant is never going to be attractive unless you can beat the performance of those assistive technologies. But that's the race we're in. Right now, we can beat assistive technologies in LIS, in locked-in state, because there is no assistive technology. That's the gap we step in. From there, we develop the skills, the knowledge to build more sophisticated, like speech decoding. But it's still, you have to evaluate what the benefit is to a patient. And the last part, which we haven't even touched upon, is what does it take for a user to learn to use the system? Nowadays, with the machine learning, it's going to be an intelligent response to an intelligent signal generator. That tends to be a very unstable marriage. So we don't know how the user is going to make sure that the machine is going to do what it wants. Something we really don't want is sentences coming out that are most likely the sentences according to the large language model, but which are not what you intend to say. And the last one, of course, is what are the factors that determine whether it's going to work for you or not? And I've shown you a little bit about, the brainstem stroke problem, late stage ALS problem. Those are things that we're not going to discover for the next 20 years until there's a device that can be implanted in a reasonable number of patients. And then we can do what we call a clinical trial, but we're not there yet. So the last techniques, I don't know if I'm running over time badly, but it's acceptable, but not too bad. The last thing, this is what people are working on. This higher density is 3 millimeter. We're working on 0.9 millimeter distance, and we still find that the signals are distinguishable. They're not independent anymore. They're distinguishable. And this is some ideas from San Francisco. Similar concept, maybe less than 1 millimeter distance. And this is devices. I'm spending most of my time trying to get devices up to a level where we're allowed to implant them in people with locked-in state. There's one. This is one actually that's from a company. These are electrodes that are on a stent. So this is a mesh that's stretched into very thin. It's put onto a lead that goes into a vein in your leg, and it's pushed all the way up into the sinus, and it's placed by the motor cortex SMA, and there's a clinical trial going now. The company is called Synchron. The disadvantage is that you can get clicks, but there's no concept, no perspective of getting the type of decoding that you get with electrodes on the gray matter, like I just showed you. There's a German company with a 32 channel. They finalized the design in 2010, and it's still not on the market, just to show you how difficult it is to get a company to get it approved by the regulatory bodies. Neuralink is in the news. They have about 1,000 channels on, like, I think, tens of electrodes on a hair. Their concept is that they put the electrodes, which are about 3 millimeters long, 3-4 millimeters, and they put them in the cortex, and they're so thin that they don't damage the cortex. The Utah array can damage the cortex. Whenever the person moves, the array moves a little bit, even micrometers. It generates a unpleasant response from the brain. So they started a clinical trial. First recruitment was a couple of weeks ago in the US, and it looks like they're allowed to implant 6 people. So we'll hear more about that somewhere in the future. And this is a device that's developed in Geneva. It's 128 channels, and I'm struggling to get the engineers to stop improving so we can start putting a prototype in a human. So just to show that I'm the one that goes around and gives the talks, but these are the people that actually do the work that I present. So with that, I'm done.
Thanks a lot for this impressive overview of, a decade or more of work now. It's also impressive how you keep this energy up and follow like different lines and tracks that seem to be most promising. You reported about 3 implanted ECOG patients where after a while signal quality was going down, or you lost a patient maybe due to a progressive form of dementia that comes with ALS, or maybe because of the atrophy that you mentioned. The ECOG you used was subdural, I assume.
Yeah.
What do you think is the effect of the atrophy? And there's also again and again discussions about epidural implantations that may be even less invasive in a sense. Would they suffer even stronger from atrophy because suddenly you get large distance to?
Yeah, no, it's a very good question. And so the way I see an electrode is like a broad angle camera. If you have an EEG electrode, it measures from centimeter surface, because that's the radius at 2 centimeter distance between the scalp and the brain. If you have an ECOG electrode, it's directly on the gray matter. There's a little bit of PA and CSF in between, right? Because we can't fix the electrodes to the brain. So if there's atrophy, you'll see that the brain withdraws from the electrode contact. And with that, there's an increase in CSF and the angle widens. And then at some point, it's going to correlate with the other electrode, and then you just lose a lot of information because you get more and more tissue in the signal. And it gets a lot weaker, right? Because it's more distant than average. So if I've thought about epidural, which means between the brain and the dura, so you don't have to, pierce the dura. For regulatory, the requirements are no less. So the safety tests that you have to do for any implant are exactly the same for outside and in the dura. So that's not a reason to do it. And then with atrophy, I think it's better to go underneath, stay inside. And what we do is we have this silicone strip, 4 electrodes that I showed you. We attach them underneath the skull between 2 holes, and we push them together a little bit. So there's like a bit of tension to stay on the brain. And that seems to work reasonably. And all that you lose with epidural. You really stay at the surface. So I kind of lost my interest. Plus the surgeries, everybody says, surgery highly risky. It's not. For the last 20 years, anesthesiology has had incredible improvements in performance. They can keep someone alive and awake without that person having any pain. So that's not an issue. The sterility, the way that people work in the Western hospitals, reduces infection rates. I think you can have temporary problems like an infection that can be treated with medication or something. The risk of permanent damage because of bleeding or a cut or something is like 1 or 2% or so. So I'll stay under the dura for now. But it's a really good question because I thought, well, much better. Then it's no longer brain surgery.
So the last year, there were some research published about how you can decode motor imagery with EEG. So no need for surgery. So relating to the previous question about atrophy, do you think that's going to be the direction of research for motor imagery and moving a cursor and maybe...
So your question is, does EEG have a future for patients?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Do you think it has improved using the decoding algorithms?
I think so. No, the whole a lot of the BCI that ECOG people started getting interesting is from EEG, and the motor potential has always been interesting, but in terms of it working for patients, I think there's a couple of things that make it more difficult for locked-in patients. For one, if you need to fit electrodes, and it needs a little bit of skill, that it will work for the first couple of weeks or months, but then it will stop because the care team circulates a lot. That's this 4th phase of research. The care team changes a lot, and they're not all trained. And then it means that at some points, there's a person who has no idea what to do with the EEG system, so it's not going to be used. So that's a huge, and that's also Teresa Vaughan, you can ask her this afternoon. That's one of the things that takes effort. The second thing is people really don't like to look weird. So the CAP, they'll do it, but late stage ALS, they look awful. They look like ghosts because there's not a single muscle to keep your jaw closed or your eyes open or closed. You look like a corpse. So they don't want to have anything that makes them look even weirder. And the third thing is that, but maybe, you can also talk to this, not everyone is capable of generating the motor signal that's strong enough for an EEG electrode. Somehow, and we notice it, some people have great difficulty imagining, trying to make the movement. So I'd say all the different options should be there. Like Jose Milano always says, why compete? The needle people, the disc people, like I just said, I call them needle and disc people, or the EEG, or even FNIRS. Why would we compete? Why not offer a palette of options to people that want to have something to help them out? So I just happen to be in this corner, and I think the EEG has a great chance, but it has to overcome some of the things that I just talked about for patients to use it.
And one quick question about Neuralink that you discussed in the end. There's going to be a clinical trial. Is it going to be about motor functions? What is the purpose of the trial?
But that's the only thing they can do. Okay. That's the only area where you can predict what you know exactly the labels of what you're trying to decode. And the other thing is not going to be helpful. So I'm quite sure they're going to go to start in the hand area. Or maybe Elon Musk got mad at the Nature papers because that's what he does. Feels conned out of his limelight. Maybe they'll put it in the face area. I don't know what the FDA gave approval for. That's secret. So I will see some results.
Okay, it's really interesting. Thanks. Yeah.
Hi, thank you so much for your talk. I was wondering, you mentioned about the decoders failing at night. So I was wondering if this is they're failing in general at night when the patient is awake. Is it they're failing during sleep? Is there a need for sleep decoder? So if you can just talk a bit more about that.
Yeah. So when she said, my eye tracker doesn't work at night anymore, because she had an eye tracker, she could activate it when she was awake. We said, okay, we'll give you a decoder. And we started recording the number of hits, and we had like 1,000 false positives because she was asleep. And we said, okay, our decoder, why doesn't it work? And it turned out that I have a slide, but it is fine. The amplitude of fluctuations of both the low frequency band power and the high frequency band power was hugely increased. So basically, what we figured in her, and we're trying to figure out whether it's also the case in non-paralyzed people, where the signal becomes much more noisy and energetic, which means that our decoder found random patterns and it just kept hitting. So we took almost a year to try all kinds of combinations, because you try a combination, you have to wait for a couple of weeks, try another one. And we came with a method where when she would be asleep, the system would be monitoring the brain, but it would be in off standby. What she then had to do was try to move her fingers at the rhythm of her respiration machine. So the ventilator goes on every 4 seconds. It has a cycle of 8 seconds. So in those 8 seconds, she would, whatever, every pulse, she would move, rest, up to 1 minute and 20 seconds. And we thought, she's never going to do this. 1 minute and 20 seconds to wake up the system. And she said, I'm fine. I have no problem with it. And that worked really well until the point where we needed to adjust the parameters because the signal was going down. And then since you're not there, you have to rely on people cooperating. And the caregiver said, it just goes on all the time. And the caregivers come in at night, but they also sleep. And they just wake up when the alarm goes off. So they had to wake up 10 times a night for nothing because she was still asleep. So they said, we're not going to use it anymore. It's a struggle, I can tell you. But it's possible.
Mm-hmm.
Hi, thank you for the talk. You had this one slide about the implant not working for a specific patient. And I was wondering if there are already some sort of screening procedures in place to decide whether or not, I was thinking of some sort of like an EEG-based screening to decide whether or not you should be doing the surgery, just because, expectation management, I imagine, can be like a huge struggle in itself. So is there something already in place, or?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So we figured, well, it would be great if we know beforehand whether someone is eligible. I mean, that's apart from the fact that ALS is a continuously, performance declining disease. So it's a photograph. It's brought in. So we're trying to get the EEG, but there are no people that have implantable BCI. The only people in the world that have fully implanted BCI with ALS are these three. Right, all the others have an external connector. They only participate in daily research, daytime research. So we don't know. So we're trying to get these patients back for an EEG, but it turns out that nobody likes the EEG. They all hate the scraping, because we get a clinical EEG, right? Because you want to have a good signal. That's what we're trying to do now, and it would really be nice to have the EEG as a predictor, especially for people with brainstem stroke, to find out about the beta signal. But right now, we don't have enough people that are implanted to be able to do that. So as soon as we say, let's say I would like to do a clinical trial with 20 patients or so with the same device, and then that will definitely be one part of it. But
sorry, like a small clarification. What I meant was, can you do like an EEG screening before the person is implanted to know whether the implanted?
That's what I'm talking about, right? So you do an EEG before they go in, and then you get the BCI measurements to correlate it with EEG. But that's it's catch-22.
Thank you. I'm really thought.
So returning to the sleep and the EEG, like you gave very good arguments why they don't like the EEG. We're doing quite some sleep research here, and partially that's done with high density EEG system, and partially it's also done with these headbands with only a few electrodes on the forehead, which actually seem to be quite good in detecting sleep stages. So would it be a possibility to combine EEG in the night with the BCI, where the EEG would inform whether the patient is awake or not, and then where the EEG basically switch the BCI on and off?
I think it would be very feasible. I haven't really thought of it that way because we're getting into the sleep phenomena for EEG. But if it's reliability is key, given that caregivers will just stop using it, which means it's abandoned, which is our biggest nightmare. I think we should talk.
Yeah.
I mean, it's very doable because you have a decoding machine that can read multiple channels. So,
Let's talk. Yeah, good.
Absolutely.
For the sake of time, I think we should go and have coffee now. So thank you very much.
Yeah.